A document that was classified top secret for almost 40 years has come to light, and it could change the way some of our history books are written. And Lynn has the details on that.
Tim, the document was brought to our attention through a project we've been working on for several weeks now, which we'll tell you about in a moment. But because it could have such an effect nationwide, we decided to go ahead and make it public tonight. This was a highly secret memo from a top government official written nearly 50 years ago. It came from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. and has been authenticated. It relates to the imprisonment of thousands of Americans in Hawaii during World War II. They were rounded up just after Pearl Harbor and without a trial were put in internment camps. Many stayed there throughout the 4 years of the war. Income was lost and property was seized. Military and government officials maintained it was the only way to make sure potential spies and sympathizers were under control. These Americans were people who themselves or whose ancestors had once come from Japan. It has always been said to have been a byproduct of the shock and panic following the attack on Pearl Harbor that began World War II. These Americans of Japanese ancestry have fought for years to remedy what they felt was an injustice and a violation of their constitutional rights. Lawsuits have been filed. Reparations hearings have been held. Up until now, Congress has had no evidence that the internment was more than a reaction to the Japanese attack. We'd like to read to you now the text of this document. It is directed to the Chief of Naval Operations. One obvious thought occurs to me, that every Japanese citizen or non-citizen on the island of Oahu who meets these Japanese ships or has any connection with their officers or men should be secretly but definitely identified and his or her name placed on a special list of those who would be the first to be placed in a concentration camp in the event of trouble. The secret document is dated August 10th, 1936, 5.5 years before Pearl Harbor. The author is U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Japanese ships Roosevelt is referring to were regular merchant ships that docked in Honolulu often. It was the custom for local Japanese Americans to go welcome visitors or relatives from their home provinces in Japan. This man unearthed the document from the National Archives after years of research.
Well, this document proves that the President of the United States, the man who's supposed to be the head of all Americans, right, ordered the military to secretly spy on a certain group of American citizens and to set them up for being sent to concentration camp in the event that America might one day go to war with the country from which they or their parents or their grandparents once came.
This is one of the most important documents that has come about since the war.
Colonel Frank Steer was Provost Marshal of Honolulu during World War II. His territory included the entire Pacific.
First picked up, but there were about 4,000 on our so-called crap list of those that might give evidence or information to the enemy if they had an opportunity. Well, it had accumulated over a period of probably 20 or 30 years, ever since the military came out here. They started immediately. They didn't trust the Japanese or any of the aliens, Germans or Italians. And particularly after World War I started, we had dossiers on everything we were going to do in case of war, and that was one of them. And I knew exactly how many people I was going to have to take care of on December, well, if an attack came.
We spoke to Senator Daniel Inouye by telephone today.
It saddens me very much to learn of the existence of this document.
To your knowledge, has the Commission had any evidence up until now that there was prior planning to this degree?
No, this is the first time I've learned of anything this serious.
John Tateishi is the attorney handling the Japanese American Citizens League lawsuit. ABC News spoke to him today.
Looking through documents in the archives, I don't know how many I've seen, thousands, literally thousands of documents. I've never seen FDR's mentioning, prior to the internment process actually taking place, mentioning the internment or a roundup at all. This is the first time, this is the earliest document that I've seen where the president actually talks about it.
Minoru Yasui is the Japanese American Citizens League Redress Committee chairman.
Here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, is talking about people being placed into concentration camps. And let me emphasize the word concentration camps. It means then the chief executive of our country were talking about placing American citizens into a concentration camp as early as 1936.
As it stands now, Congress reparations hearings have been closed. The Japanese American Citizens League is continuing its court battles, and it's expected this document will add significant strength to the case, both legally and politically. Again, this document, according to the National Archives, was written by then-President Franklin Roosevelt. It's only one of many pieces of fascinating information in a book, The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor, written by Tony Hodges. And next week, we'll be looking at many more intriguing things on our newscast.
Well, this week in News Center 4, we're going to have a different type of news story, and Lynn's going to tell us about it.
Tim, it's one told in a new book, The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor. Now, the book is published, but the news story is still being written, and we're hoping you can help us with the pieces. It's different in many ways. Because it's so complex, we'll be broadcasting a new segment each night at 9:30. So if you want to see all 10 segments, you have to catch them the first time around. And after each segment, we'll be asking you for more clues. Those which shed new light on the mysteries will include in later news reports. We're going to reveal some stories this week that will surprise you, and we hope to get back from you some really interesting clues. Our story begins before the turn of the century. It culminates December 7th, 1941. One of America's retired admirals, Kemp Tolley, who fought in the war, perhaps sums up the search for the truth about it best.
We have a major philosophical question. Why bother about Pearl Harbor, for heaven's sake? It's like discussing with me the Spanish-American War. It's dead. It's finished. Is it really?
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Arizona Memorial. It symbolizes not only the loss of life at Pearl Harbor, but the deaths of all the Americans in the 4 years that followed. World War II broke out on December 7th, 1941, but it actually began over half a century before that, and the search for the truth about it continues even today. On our search, we found some clues in this book, The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor, and its author.
I lived in Hawaii about 15 years and had never really come out here, and then my mother came to visit, and she wanted to come out here because this was the war of her generation. And so we came to the memorial and looked around. I was very struck by seeing the oil that still comes up. I watched it come up and spread out, and then I smelled it. And it was kind of like a connection to the people who were still down there in a way 40 years later. And I was curious as to why they were down there.
Whatever happened before will always happen again. So therefore, we can't help but be interested in what was behind it all, who was guilty, if anybody, and what could have been done to avoid it.
In exploring this book, we ended up really raising more questions than we answered. So we're hoping this week you can help us. You may have a clue or a piece to the puzzle that nobody else knows about. So join us as we look below the surface and journey back in time. For instance...
James Bond here. Can I have a car sent to 2171 Magenta Drive?
That's the James Bond we all know, but was he ever a real man? The author of the James Bond novels, Ian Fleming, says yes. Fleming was a spy master for Britain during World War II and said he modeled the character after one of his agents, Duško Popov, a Yugoslavian who spied first for Nazi Germany and then for Britain. Perhaps the world's most famous double agent, Popov fulfilled in real life many of the tales told in the Bond films. An international playboy and womanizer, he led a life of constant danger and intrigue. One of his most daring missions involved Pearl Harbor. How could that possibly be? Well, to answer that question, we go to Taranto Bay, Italy, 1 year before Pearl Harbor. Using carrier-launched torpedo planes, the British execute a surprise attack and sink several of the Italian battleships seen below. The significance of the surprise attack is not missed in America. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox sends a warning memo to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. If war comes with Japan, it is believed easily possible that hostilities would be initiated by a surprise attack on the fleet or the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Knox wasn't the only one who thought this. Japan quickly asks Germany to get details of the attack. The Germans do this secretly and even decide to send a spy to Hawaii. They give him this list of questions on Pearl Harbor defenses. Who do they choose? Dusko Popov, the real James Bond. What happened is recounted in his autobiography, Spy Counter Spy, and in books by other British intelligence officers. Popov flies to America in August of 1941 and personally tells FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that Japan plans to attack Pearl Harbor before the end of December. What does Hoover do with this revelation? Hoover says he didn't believe the Playboy spy. But we do know that 4.5 months later in Hawaii, Robert Shivers, the top FBI man, knows something.
Mr. Shivers was one of the early special agents in the early history of the FBI, and I know that Mr. Hoover maintained a close personal relationship with those men who had sort of come along with him in the growth of the Bureau in the early years.
Shivers calls a young police lieutenant into his office in the Dillingham building. It is the week before December 7th. Shivers tells the officer that we are going to be attacked before the week is out. That police lieutenant is the future governor of Hawaii, John A. Burns. And if you have any additional information on what we've told you so far, give us a call at Channel 4. Tonight at 9:30, we will hear, in Burns' own words, what was said in that office. All this week on News Center 4, we're exploring the mysteries of Pearl Harbor. The stories we're presenting are part of a new book of the same title, but the news story about the event is still not finished. We're hoping you'll be able to help us by providing more clues and calling us this week if you have any information that could help complete the puzzle. And we're only airing the segments once. So now, part 2 of the Mysteries of Pearl Harbor. Earlier tonight, we showed you the James Bond connection, the real double agent Dusko Popov, who warned FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that the Japanese planned to attack Pearl Harbor. Hoover's man in Hawaii, Robert Shivers, in turn told then Police Lieutenant John A. Burns. UH Professor Paul Hooper recorded conversations with Burns as part of the Burns Oral History Project shortly before the former governor died.
What struck me most, I guess, was how matter-of-fact he was about the entire issue. He had been told by people he respected that this would be coming. He accepted that, even though he never knew the actual source of the information. He speculated about it, but he never really knew it. He obviously took this seriously. This, in other words, is not something that Jack Burns fabricated. It was something that he believed sincerely.
Shivers called me in one day, about a week before the war started, closed the doors and says, "I'm not telling my men this, but I'm telling you. We're going to be attacked before a week is out." And the guy had tears in his eyes.
Burns says he was not directly told the source of the information.
The only possibility that occurs to me is Great Britain's international espionage ability.
Is your feeling that Mr. Hoover was in fairly close touch with British intelligence?
That's not only my guess, but my very solid thought from my 3 years or one year association directly with the FBI and practically being a member of it.
The important thing, I think, to note about this, however, is that this is not the first time that the suggestion of foreknowledge was made, and it certainly is not going to be the last time. In other words, this doesn't prove or disprove that suggestion. What it does do, though, is add one more piece, a rather intriguing piece, I think, of evidence about the possibility of foreknowledge, and in that sense, it's contributed to a resurgent debate over the origins of the Pearl Harbor attack.
But exactly what is the puzzle that we're working with? Well, it begins decades before Pearl Harbor. The modern-day tensions between America and Japan began with a bang. That was the mysterious explosion of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor. This triggered American expansion across the Pacific, with Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines falling under the American flag in one incredible year, 1898. In Japan, this was perceived as a direct threat. Ironically, the explosion of the Maine took the lives of at least 7 Japanese crewmen, perhaps the first to die in the service of America. But then the tables were turned, and Japan became the threat to the U.S.
The real fear among the people in America came after the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-5. For the first time, the yellow race, so-called, defeated the white race. So, from the turn of the century, I would say Japan was targeted as the future enemy of the United States.
The result was increasing restrictions on immigrants from Japan. They were allowed to fight for America during World War I, like Walter Fujikami. You were with the company of all Japanese, right?
Yes, we had Japanese. But after when the war came in, we had the draftees come in. And still, we had mostly all Japanese.
About how many?
250. Yeah.
And they all carried guns and were part of the National Guard. But they were not allowed to become U.S. citizens.
No. They interpreted that the Constitution then had only black and white. So Japanese being what? Yellow race, Mongolian race, whatever, not mentioned specifically in the Constitution. So they were not recognized.
The Japanese Empire continued its conquests. Formosa and Korea and the Pacific Islands to Manchuria and then on into China. The American, British, and Dutch were afraid that their own conquests, such as the Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia, would be next. And in an attempt to halt Japan, they threw up a blockade 5 months before Pearl Harbor.
Before they starved to death for oil, we had embargoed their oil, embargoed their foodstuffs, frozen their funds. They had no choice but to fight.
Just to recap tonight, Shivers was a top FBI man, a professional. Why then, according to Burns, did he have tears in his eyes? Because he knew of the attack? Or were they for the men he knew were going to die and whom he could not save? And if, as Tolley says, America knew Japan had no choice but to fight, why did over 2,000 men at Pearl Harbor have to die? If you know something more about these stories, call us here at Channel 4. And tomorrow on our 5:30 news, we think you'll be surprised by the amount of wiretapping and bugging that was going on here. You might even wonder how anything was kept secret. If you were watching ABC's World News Tonight just prior to News Center 4, you saw a report by Ken Kashiwahara on a 1936 presidential memo from Franklin Roosevelt. News Center 4 first broadcast that story Friday. It's one of the things uncovered in a new book, The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor, which we're exploring all this week on our newscast. We'll be recapping that story tonight on our 9:30 broadcast. But now we're going to present part 3 in a series of 10 reports on the mysteries of Pearl Harbor, each of which is only being aired once. When nations play high-stakes poker with each other, the country that manages to look at the other one's cards often wins. One way to do that is by breaking the other's codes. During its negotiations with the U.S. before Pearl Harbor, Japan used its most secret diplomatic code called Purple. In August of 1940, the U.S. broke this code and built several Purple machines like this to read Japan's most secret messages. One Purple machine was supposed to have gone to Pearl Harbor, but it went to the British instead, who then broke their promise to give America the German Enigma decoding machine in return. Still, there was a Purple machine in Honolulu at the Japanese consulate, where it was used to send secret cablegrams like these to Tokyo, which reported on the movement and locations of ships at Pearl Harbor.
The Army at Fort Shafter was intercepting radio messages from the Japanese Consulate General in Honolulu, which, if deciphered in time, would have made it perfectly clear that, without a doubt, that Pearl Harbor was the target. They talked about barrage balloons. Now is the time for a surprise attack. I don't think they have torpedo nets.
If we had had a Purple machine here in Honolulu, would December 7th, 1941 have been just another lovely Sunday in Hawaii? But Purple and other broken codes were not the only way we knew what was going on here at the Japanese consulate in 1941. The telephone wires were tapped. Let's take a look at who was listening to whom and how. The FBI was eavesdropping on the consulate from the second story of the Dillingham building. The Office of Naval Intelligence was also recording conversations from the Alexander Young Hotel. And whenever a telegram went to or from the consulate via RCA or Globe Wireless, copies were slipped to U.S. authorities. Interestingly, neither the FBI man nor the Navy man could understand Japanese, so they had to decide by the tone of voice if the conversation was worth recording. Sterling Adams was a special agent with the FBI at the time.
We maintained recording machines, rather bulky equipment at that time, nothing like the sophisticated equipment that you have today. Was maintained in our vault area.
Whatever was recorded by the FBI would later be translated by Saburo Chiwa.
I think it was Japanese consulates and also the overseas to Tokyo was being tapped.
The overseas telephone call.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they'd go on in the evening, and next day when I get there, then I'd have to start listening to all the records.
In the case of the Navy, a man named Ted Emanuel listened in. He is no longer alive, but a friend, George Hooton, remembers Emanuel talking about his activities and how they came to an abrupt end just a few days before Pearl Harbor.
Just prior to the war, on approximately December 3rd, how the telephone company discovered his taps, and he was made to have to remove them because they were afraid of an international incident if they were discovered by the Japanese. And they were afraid, since the phone company had found them, that this word would get out to them. And Ted he was obsessed by the thought that had he been able to keep his taps on longer, they might have had some warning of the attack. And some of the last information he was getting from them was that the consulate had commenced burning their codes and other papers, which Ted believed to his dying day was a signal that they knew or expected the attack was coming.
Although the Navy tap was cut off, the FBI tap stayed on.
There was a lot of excitement at the Japanese consulate that they were in the process of burning their codes and important papers, and that information was immediately transmitted to the intelligence heads of the other agencies, naval intelligence, military intelligence, and with the observation by Shivers, the agent in charge, that this appeared significant, that something was in the wind, so to speak.
And as we heard from Admiral Tolley previously, yet another group of listeners was intercepting all international calls, this one at Fort Shafter. News Center 4 has also heard of the existence of a listening post, apparently unknown to the Navy and FBI, through which all telephone calls on Oahu had to go. Was there really such a place? We've also been told of an underground facility called Hut X. Are they the same thing? The real mystery is, with all these taps and people listening, why was the attack still a surprise? If you have a clue or some more information about anything we've presented tonight, please give us a call here at Channel 4. This week, News Center 4 is exploring the mysteries of Pearl Harbor, a new book which raises some intriguing questions. And we're asking you to help us solve some of the mysteries by calling us if you have some information you thought you'd like to share. Well, tonight we're going to show you a card that most of you have never seen, and we're going to give you a puzzle to solve. So now, part 4 of the mysteries of Pearl Harbor. Earlier tonight, we told you how America broke Japan's purple code with this machine, tapped the phones in Honolulu's Japanese consulate, then eavesdropped from FBI, Navy, and Army listening posts. Because the intercepted conversations were in Japanese, which no FBI agents understood, they depended totally on Saburo Chiwa to translate. The Navy depended on another American of Japanese ancestry. Ironically, these dedicated men came from the very group of Americans who were secretly slated for concentration camps by a recently declassified memo of President Roosevelt's dated 5.5 years before Pearl Harbor. Since News Center 4 broke the story last week, it has received national coverage and reactions. Colonel Frank Steer, Provost Marshal of Hawaii at the time, said the military didn't trust Americans of Japanese ancestry at all.
The danger of the Japanese, aliens particularly, dual citizens, those who had both American and Japanese citizenship, and even some of the local Katonks, as we call them, they were sort of a menace to us because we didn't know what would happen to our vital installations, how the Japanese would react if we were attacked.
Walter Fujikami served in World War I. But for the first part of World War II, Americans of Japanese ancestry were not allowed to serve their country. Did you feel any resentment since you had served in World War I that in World War II?
I had a little resentment, and I thought, inside my heart, I say, I'm going to fix them too. I say. Not the nasty way, but in business way, I said, I had to be on top.
Here's another document. How many of you know what it is? All Americans of Japanese or other Oriental ancestry had to have one of these if they wanted to go to the mainland. It's a certificate of American citizenship.
In 1924, Congress passed the so-called Oriental Exclusion Act. This is 1924. This meant that Chinese, Japanese, actually Chinese had been excluded earlier, 1882. But since we were of Oriental extraction, we were American citizens, but if we wanted to go to the mainland, we had to have proof of our citizenship.
I remember we had to get a certificate of Hawaiian citizenship, which I think is just like what you say, an internal passport, even going, within the United States.
And what about Saburo Chiwa, the FBI's only Japanese translator? Did he have to have one?
Yes, I had. One of these was issued to me just before I left for Japan.
The Western image of the Japanese at the time was one of a sneaky, cunning people, and this famous photograph has often been used to support that image. It has been reproduced in many books on Pearl Harbor and is generally explained as a mock-up of Pearl Harbor, with the Japanese using it to plan their attack. But is it really what it seems? Look at it carefully for clues to its origin. We'll be giving you what we think is the answer to the puzzle later on this week. And tomorrow night on our 5:30 news, we're going to tell you about a Dutchman and a four-star general. And had we listened to them, there might not have been a Pearl Harbor. This week, News Center 4 is airing a special report on the book, The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor, a new book that raises some very intriguing questions. And we're depending on you to provide us with clues to some of the mysteries by calling us. Tonight in our 5th installment, we hear about a series of warnings which originated with Dutch intelligence in Java.
Our then Colonel, now General Thorpe, he was there as military attaché, and he was passing information to Washington that the jig was up, the balloon was up, that it was only a matter of hours, perhaps days at the most. Now, what happened to that information?
General Elliot Thorpe, now age 88, lives in Sarasota, Florida. In 1941, he was a U.S. military observer in Java. About a week before the attack on Pearl Harbor, General Hein Terpoorten, commander of the Dutch Army in the East Indies, comes secretly to Thorpe. Terpoorten reveals to Thorpe that Dutch intelligence has uncovered Japanese plans to attack Malaya, Guam, and Hawaii. Thorpe immediately sends a message in Navy code to the Army and General Marshall in Washington, D.C.
In the next 4 or 5 days, I sent 3 more messages that the Dutch had decoded. And after the 4th message, I got a wire back from the War Department that said, don't send us any more of this. So that ended that. Now, why they didn't want me to send them any more, I don't know. And I'm not going to even try to guess.
The Dutch general, Terpoorten, who warned Thorpe, did not stop there.
And he also sent it to the Dutch military attaché at the Dutch embassy in Washington. And Colonel Wireman, who was the Dutch military attaché, took this message in person to General George Marshall, who was then Chief of Staff of the Army. And according to what Wireman told me later on, General Marshall read it and said, well, do you expect me to believe this?
What did Marshall do with Thorpe's warnings? And when Congress later held its hearings on the attack, why wasn't Thorpe's story explained?
Later on in the investigations, some people denied they had ever seen it. But I had competent authority from Colonel Moses Pettigrew, who was in the G2 office, that he saw it and read it. And in the congressional investigation after Pearl Harbor, some of my messages showed up in the investigation, but they had been so emasculated I hardly recognized them. Now, after the war was over, some years later, I met General Teporten in Holland, and he said to me at dinner, "Did you ever really send that message I gave you?" And I said, "Yes, I certainly did." Well, he said, "I just wanted to know."
Whether or not General Marshall took Thorpe's warning seriously, someone in the Army did, and sent out urgent telegrams that reached even an obscure cavalry outpost in El Centro, California. Brooks Hoyt now lives in Hawaii. In 1941, he was a cryptographer at Camp Sealy near the Mexican border. On November 28th, Hoyt decoded an Army telegram that warned, "The Japanese Navy has left Tokyo, and our Navy does not know where it was bound or where it is now." On December 2nd, he decoded a second Army telegram, which he has saved for 41 years. It said, "Navy reports hostile action by Japan possible any moment. Take due precautions, but limited dissemination of this information. Signed, Otto-sen." On December 4th, Hoyt decoded a third secret telegram.
"Japanese attack by their Navy is imminent upon the Philippines, Hawaii, and the United States mainland. All post camps and stations are placed on alert."
The mystery is, if Hoyt's unit, composed of men on horseback, was warned about a possible attack on Hawaii, then were the men who manned the targeted ships at Hawaii's Pearl Harbor warned too? And if not, why not?
I can't understand or conceive that a larger station did not get what we got, alerting us and putting us on an alert, and not alerting a place like San Diego, Long Beach, and Hawaii, where they are actually mentioned in the message, and the Philippines. It would seem to me that they must have received the message too.
Another mystery is the name Otto-sen, with which all three telegrams were signed. What or who is Otto-sen? If you have a clue, give us a call at Channel 4. Tonight at 9:30, we'll hear a first-hand account of what may have been a sighting of the Japanese fleet on its way here. And we'll look into the possibility that America was secretly at war 3 days before December 7th. Now don't forget, we want your help in solving some of these mysteries, so if you have a story you'd like to tell us, please give us a call at News Center 4. This week we're exploring the mysteries of Pearl Harbor in a series of reports about clues raised in this new book. And tonight we received a lead from a viewer as to the identity of Otto-sen. We mentioned the name Otto-sen on our 5:30 news as the name signed to 3 telegrams warning about a possible attack. Well, we're confirming it now, and we'll tell you who it is, who we think it is, tomorrow on our 5:30 news. Now in part 6 of Mysteries, was America secretly at war 3 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor? And how many times was the Japanese fleet sighted on its way to the islands? We heard earlier tonight from a 4-star general who was warned and in turn warned Washington to expect a Japanese attack on Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and Malaya. We also met a man who decoded telegrams containing that warning at an obscure outpost in Southern California. Why was Hawaii not warned? You might find the answer at the end of the rainbow. Not the rainbow you're thinking of, but Rainbow 5, a war plan kept secret from the U.S. Congress and the American people. 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the Americans and British drew up an agreement to protect their colonies from Japan's conquest south. 5 months before Pearl Harbor, the Americans, British, and Dutch threw up a blockade in an attempt to force Japan out of China and to stop the Japanese from moving south.
We had embargoed their oil, embargoed their foodstuffs, frozen their funds. They had no choice but to fight.
Japan moved south anyway. Then the 3 countries drew a line. The agreement was, if Japan entered that zone shown in yellow, America could be automatically committed to go to war without ever being attacked by Japan. Less than a week before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese convoys were approaching that trigger line.
You see, Roosevelt had got himself out on the end of a very long limb. He had promised the British ambassador, Lord Halifax, in Washington on 5 December 1941, that if the British were attacked in the far east of the Japanese, the Americans would come to their aid with armed assistance. He had no legal right to do this. Congress then still very carefully and jealously guarded his prerogatives as far as declaring war was concerned.
3 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese crossed the trigger line, and the secret Rainbow War Plan goes into effect. Ed Tremper is a retired captain of a tour boat that goes to Pearl Harbor. In 1941, he was a cryptographer with the U.S. Navy under Admiral Thomas Hart. He remembers 3 days before Pearl Harbor, his ships were ordered urgently to leave Manila for Borneo. Once in Borneo, they received an even more urgent order.
At about 10 p.m. on the 7th of December, which is Borneo time, we got an urgent order to round up all the shore parties, get them back to the ship, and get the entire fleet underway and proceed to Singapore.
Now, Borneo is across the international date line, so by Hawaii time, the fleet got that order at 3 a.m. December 7th, 4 hours before Pearl Harbor was attacked.
And the orders read to proceed direct to Singapore and, in effect, to put our war plan into effect.
Which would be to work with the British and the Dutch.
Work with the British and the Dutch.
That, of course, fulfilled the secret war agreement and followed the plan of Rainbow 5. You are looking at that secret war plan. We knew of its existence, but had never seen a copy of it until a viewer saw our reports this week and brought us the plan. He obtained it from the National Archives. According to the sequence of events just described, America may have already been at war when Jim Hoban saw something he has never forgotten. In 1941, Hoban was a lookout on the modern cruiser Chicago. It looked like this and was one of the first ships to be equipped with the latest and top-secret radar. It was on an emergency mission escorting the aircraft carrier Lexington to Midway Island. En route one night, Hoban went into the radio shack to get in out of the cold.
The 12 to 4 watch, I don't know what time in that 12 to 4 time on, I believe, Friday morning. I believe Friday morning, but it's possible that it could have been Saturday morning. I'm not really certain. When the radar operator who was watching the screen got real excited and upset, and he started pointing. There were several big blips and a whole bunch of little blips on the screen. He named the distance over the horizon. I can't remember that distance now, several thousand yards over the horizon, and they're showing 60 or 80 feet above the horizon. He says there are only very few ships in the world that'll do that, and most of them are men of war.
The Chicago was on radio silence, not allowed to communicate. Hoban says someone, he doesn't know who, made a decision it was a fishing fleet, and that was the end of it.
Had someone had the good judgment to break radio silence and report what we were seeing, it's possible there would not have been a December 7th.
A few days earlier, and to the west, a pilot on patrol from the carrier Enterprise reported sighting a large fleet at the end of his search pattern. Another Enterprise pilot confirmed the story, but told us because of his job, he was advised not to speak to us publicly. But maybe some of you will. We'd like to hear from you if you know anything about the Enterprise or Chicago stories we presented tonight, or if you can tell us something about Rainbow 5 and the secret war agreement to confirm even further the information we already have. The question seems to be, if President Roosevelt actually committed us to war before Pearl Harbor, did he know something like Pearl Harbor would happen to spark the American people to fight? Well, tomorrow at 5:30, did the Lurline, Matson's luxury liner, stumble across the Japanese fleet en route to the islands? And what happened to her ship's logs from that particular trip? Tonight, we have part 7 in our series based on the book, The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor. And we're going to hear the story of a retired admiral who was bait for the Japanese. Last night, we showed you the Rainbow 5 war plan and presented evidence that America was already secretly at war 3 days before Pearl Harbor. One has to wonder, as we are now only days before that attack, what is going through the minds of those in power and how much they know. Admiral Thomas Hart writes in his diary on December 5th, 1941, the major event of the day was the arrival of one Tom Phillips, Admiral, British Royal Navy, to confer on how we are to fight this coming war. 10 days prior to that, Secretary of War Henry Stimson writes in his diary of November 25th, the President brought up the event that we are likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. The question was how we should maneuver them into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. The story of Admiral Kemp Tully could easily be an answer to Roosevelt's dilemma. On December 1st, Roosevelt sends a top-secret memo to the Navy, ordering that 3 small vessels be outfitted with a naval officer, a few guns, and an American and Filipino crew, and sent on a defensive patrol, one that would surely place them in the path of the approaching Japanese. Tolley was appointed commander of one of those vessels, a 2-masted 75-foot schooner named the Lanikai. He has written a book about the incident, The Cruise of the Lanikai, and we interviewed him at his home in Baltimore, Maryland.
When I first learned of the President's order, which I didn't see until I had got to Java, obviously it became clear that this whole thing was a put-up job, so to speak. When I say that there was a tremendous note of urgency about this whole thing, it became obvious that something very big was up, and that it probably would be a one-way trip. Even though I didn't see the message until I got down to Java, the mere urgency and the tempo of the outfitting was such that I thought that there's no point in my taking my belongings along, because I won't be coming back, or at least if I do, it'll be by swimming. So I put all my personal belongings, my sword, class ring, best uniform, and so forth, ashore in Cavite Navy Yard, where 3 or 4 days later, of course, it was bombed and everything was burned up.
Tolley says Roosevelt wanted something that looked innocent on the outside but wasn't, the theory being that the Japanese wanted to avoid detection, so would probably sink any merchant ship they came into contact with.
They wanted something that didn't look like a warship, but could be called a warship after it was sunk. Why would he, first of all, want only 1 officer and 1 gun? Well, obviously the purpose was so that if she were sunk, she could be classified as a man of war and thus be used as a legal pretext to use American forces to assist the British, who were then being approached in Malaya by a Japanese task force of large proportions. As a cover, Roosevelt had said that the 3 small ships were supposed to be, quote, a defensive information patrol, unquote. Now, of course, that's absurd on the face of it, because we had no radio. If we'd seen anything, we couldn't report. And then people have said, suppose you had been sunk, how would anybody know it? Well, the whole period, we were being overflown by American patrol planes, which were getting full intelligence on Japanese movements and dispositions. I would be here today, gone tomorrow. Ipso facto sunk.
But all the same, Tolley says he can't completely fault Roosevelt.
As we reconstruct the crime, Roosevelt was a very clever man. He never wrote anything down. He wrote short memos to launch projects which he had discussed at considerable length before that. And mind you, I'm not anti-Roosevelt. I'm merely trying to find the truth. He was, like all presidents, he did what he thought he had to do. Sometimes they have to do unethical things to accomplish what they think are necessary ends. That's what he was doing. I have nothing personally against him. I think his tactics were good, his strategy was bad.
Tolley says his interpretation of the memo and its intent was later confirmed by Admiral Hart.
Now, it took me 2 days to get ready. I had no radio that would operate. I told Admiral Hart that. He said, get going, that the important thing to do is get on station. Now, Admiral Hart has told me after the war, he said, you were bait, brothers, that you were lucky to ever come back. We didn't expect to see you again.
But Tolley did make it back to tell his story, and days later, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Was the Lanikai episode the last straw to provoke the Japanese and rouse the American people to war? And once that failed, was there no choice but to allow Pearl Harbor to happen? If you know anything about Admiral Tolley's story, or if you have any other clues to add to the Pearl Harbor mystery, give us a call here. Tonight at 9:30, we'll solve the mystery of Otto-Sen and hear the incredible saga of the SS Lurline. Tonight in Part 8 of the Mysteries of Pearl Harbor, we have another look at our puzzle and a solution to the Otto-Sen story. But first, the intriguing story of the SS Lurline. The SS Lurline, Matson's famous luxury liner that routinely brought tens of thousands of visitors across the ocean to Hawaii. But something that was not routine happened on its journey to Hawaii just before Pearl Harbor. To set the stage, we must know that everything on the Lurline was top-notch, from the accommodations to the activities to the crew, including the radio operators. A search of the newspaper microfilm library produced a picture of this man, Leslie Grogan, a veteran radio operator aboard the Lurleen with an incredible story. Grogan died just a few years ago, but a signed statement he made recounting that December 1941 voyage reveals some intriguing information. On November 30th, Grogan is at his listening post and picks up a mysterious radio signal coming from 1,000 miles north of Midway. The next day, he tracks it again, but it's moved closer to Hawaii. He thinks it's the Japanese fleet and reports it to the captain. He and his chief radio officer, Rudy Asplund, continue to track the signal and begin drawing up a report for the Navy. By the time the Lurleen arrives in Honolulu at 9 a.m. the morning of December 3rd, the radio crew has tracked the source of the signals for 4 days as it moves toward the islands. Grogan and his superior Asplund head straight up Bishop Street with a report of what they discovered. They go directly to the Office of Naval Intelligence, which at the time was located here in what used to be the Alexander Young Building. In his statement, Grogan says, "We handed Lieutenant Commander Peace all the data we had compiled with regard to this Jap intercepted stuff. He was a good listener and showed little outward reflection as to what we felt was a mighty serious situation." The next day, December 4th, Grogan writes, "The Pearl Harbor Navy base sent some officers to interview Captain Bernston of the SS Lurleen. One of the officers intimated to me that the Lurleen might be taken over by the Navy. Another officer told me there was a possibility that the Navy might place Navy radio men aboard." Frank Rumlinger was a steward on the voyage and recalls the atmosphere of those couple of days in port.
You know, there was seemed to be a lot more people that's on there rather than the radio operator in Honolulu. I know before the ship sailed that day, and even the day it sailed, and even maybe a day or two prior, that it always seemed like they knew something we didn't know. You know.
The Lurleen left Honolulu on December 5th under some rather unusual circumstances, which we'll tell you about in a moment. On its voyage home to California, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Grogan writes in his statement that when the ship docked in San Francisco, Navy officials were waiting at the dock. Quote, "Lieutenant Commander Preston Allen of the Navy, whom I knew personally in World War I, entered the radio room and requested that the voyage radio log be turned over to him." End quote.
When she arrived in Honolulu and produced those records and turned them over to Naval Intelligence, her logs were seized. What happened to those things? How were they used?
There was one other interesting note to that voyage of the Lurleen. It was all set to depart in the noon sunshine, trailing the usual streamers and lays. But according to Grogan's statement, noon came, and the Lurleen sat and sat and sat. That evening, Grogan writes, military buses and trucks pull up, and hundreds of wives and children of servicemen pile out and onto the Lurleen for the voyage to San Francisco. The Lurleen finally leaves after midnight. Here is the puzzling picture we showed you before, supposedly a mock-up of Pearl Harbor used by Japan in planning the surprise attack. Look closely at it. Note the bowler hat on the man standing next to the ships. Would a military man wear such a hat? Look at the position of the ships. Now compare it with this actual photo of ships' positions during the first minutes of the attack. Are the positions different or the same? We'll be giving you the answer to this puzzle later on in the series. Now, on our 5:30 news yesterday, we showed you a telegram warning of a possible attack on Hawaii. It was signed with the name Otto-sen. At the time, we had no idea what or who Otto-sen was or stood for. But in response to our story, a viewer called in to tell us that Otto-sen was Colonel Peter Otto-sen, commander of Fort Rosecrans in San Diego. Now, obviously, Otto-sen wouldn't have had the authority to originate a message like that on his own. It must have come from a superior. Could it have been General Marshall in Washington? Well, Marshall did finally send a warning to Hawaii, the warning that came too late, and we'll look into that tomorrow at 5:30. Tonight at 9:30, we'll be concluding our Mysteries of Pearl Harbor series. All week we've been examining this book, which contains stories that haven't been told until now, and ones that obviously raise some questions about history. Part 9 brings us up to the day of the attack, and General Marshall's telegram, which historians have called the warning that came too late. In the attic of a house on Oneaba Street in Kailua's Coconut Grove, this strange document was found by a man. Not knowing what to do with it, he took it to the Honolulu Press Club, where it hung on the wall year after year. Then someone, knowing of author Tony Hodges' research on Pearl Harbor, took it down and brought it to him. Hodges says if it is what it seems, and even now he's not sure, it could change how we look at Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II. Why? Because this may be the actual warning General Marshall sent, which came too late. Now, negotiations between the U.S. and Japan had continued up until the last minute. On December 6th, the U.S. intercepts and decodes Japan's final reply in purple code, even before the Japanese embassy in Washington, for whom the message was intended, is able to. President Roosevelt reads the intercept and concludes, "This means war." 5,000 miles from the White House, the Japanese fleet steams toward Hawaii. Just before sunrise, December 7th, 183 attack aircraft are launched from their carriers. Their destination? Pearl Harbor. Popular history says that only one radar unit, the one at Kahuku, spotted the Japanese planes. But this once secret document shows that there were 3 radar stations, the one at Kahuku, a second at Ka'ava, and a third station at Kauai Loa. The men who manned those stations were awake, not asleep, and all 3 picked up the unidentified aircraft that turned out to be Japanese scout planes. At 7 a.m., the second and third stations shut down according to a new schedule set up a few days before. The Kahuku radar continued to operate, and at 7:02 got radar contact on a large mass of unidentified planes, which they reported and continued to track. They were tracked at 7:02, 7:05, 7:08, 7:11, 13, 15, 16, 18, 20, 23, 25, 27, 28, 30, 31, 33, 35, 37. The rest is history. History says we couldn't locate the Japanese aircraft carriers after the attack, but this once secret chart shows that our radar tracked the Japanese planes as they flew back to their carriers to the north. Why then were the U.S. aircraft carriers Lexington and Enterprise ordered to search to the south? At 7:33, with the attacking planes only 68 miles away, General Marshall's warning telegram finally arrives at RCA in downtown Honolulu. Because the telegram, still in code, is not marked priority, it's scheduled for regular delivery later in the morning.
Now we see on the morning of Pearl Harbor, first of all, Marshall was supposed to be out on a horseback ride. Perhaps he was. When it came time to decide whether or not to warn Pearl Harbor, Marshall procrastinated. Not only did he procrastinate in sending the message out, it was sent out by commercial telegram instead of by Navy radio, which Stark said could get out there in 3 or 4, 5, 10 minutes.
But Admiral Tolley says General Marshall may not have been where he told Congress he was.
Marshall, just a few weeks in the first investigation, couldn't remember where he was on the most momentous eve in American history. Well, according to a friend of mine who picked up my book one time and noticed the suggestions I made in there, said, I know where George Marshall was. Secretary of the Navy Knox told me that Marshall was at the White House. Marshall, Stark, Secretary of the Navy Knox were waiting at the White House in the wee hours of 7 December, waiting for the attack that they all knew would come after that intercepted Japanese message. But the point of the issue is that every indication suggests that Marshall knew far more than he ever told on the witness stand.
What Marshall did say on the witness stand is that this is the warning telegram he sent to General Short in Hawaii. Japanese are presenting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today what amounts to an ultimatum. Also, they are under orders to destroy their code machine immediately. Stop. Just what significance the hour they have set may have, we do not know, but be on alert accordingly. Stop. Inform naval authorities of this communication. And General Short testified that this is the warning he received. So according to history and the congressional hearings, this commercial telegram is the only warning Hawaii got, and it came too late. This document from the Honolulu Press Club wall is not a commercial telegram. A clue to its origin, on which we need your help, is on the back. A handwritten message there says, George, I thought you would sincerely appreciate this along with your other souvenirs. Aloha, the old man. We need to know who George is, and who is the old man. Again, the document has not been authenticated. It is a true mystery. The document is marked secret. It was received and decoded at radio station WTJ. WTJ, we have learned, was a highly secret radio station located in a tunnel at Fort Shafter. The text is nearly identical to that in Marshall's warning telegram, except it is missing the last and most important phrase: inform naval authorities of this communication. Is it possible, given the absence of that key phrase, that even if Marshall's warning had arrived in time, the Navy still would not have been warned? Tonight at 9:30, some interesting thing in Roosevelt's first draft of one of his most famous speeches. Tonight we come to the end of our week-long series on the mysteries of Pearl Harbor, and we now have much more information than when we started due to your response and your help on some of the questions we asked. In the final segment, we'd like to wrap up the clues we presented and add one more. We began this series by revealing that 5 years before Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt began planning to put Americans of Japanese ancestry and Japanese resident aliens into concentration camps in the event of war with Japan. This document has received national attention and may affect the outcome of the congressional hearings on reparations for the imprisonment of Americans during World War II. The repercussions of that revelation are still to come. In this series, historically, we started with the sinking of the USS Maine in Cuba and ended with the destruction of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. We told you about the decades of misunderstanding, mistrust, and mistakes that plagued relations between America and Japan. And we showed you also some of the people, immigrants, and Americans of Japanese ancestry who suffered mistreatment because they were caught in the middle. We heard former Governor Jack Burns say the FBI told him of the attack the week before. And we met the man who may have originally provided that information to the FBI, Dusko Popov, the man who was the real-life model for the famous James Bond. FBI agent Sterling Adams told us how the telephones in the Japanese consulate were tapped, and FBI translator Saburo Chiwa described how he would listen to the records made from those taps. George Hooton described his friend, Ted Emanuel, who oversaw the wiretaps for Navy intelligence. And Admiral Tolley revealed a third listening post at Fort Shafter. We showed you this certificate of citizenship card and talked with men who had to carry it, such as Professor Minoru Shinoda, Ted Tsukiyama, and again, one of the FBI's most trusted men, Saburo Chiwa. We showed you a copy of America's secret plan for war, which committed us to go to war with Japan even if we were not attacked. Admiral Kemp Tolley and his sailing schooner Lanikai had a secret role in that plan, a role as human bait. General Elliot Thorpe told us how he sent cables from Java day after day warning Washington of an attack until he was ordered to send no more. When he found his cables after the war, he said they were so emasculated he could hardly recognize them. Brooks Hoyt, a cryptographer in the U.S. Army Cavalry Unit in California, showed us a secret telegram he had saved for 41 years. It warned of an attack on Hawaii several days before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor tour boat captain and former Navy decoding officer Ed Tremper told us how the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in Borneo was urgently ordered to sail in support of Britain against Japan 4 hours before the sunrise attack on Pearl Harbor. Jim Hoban told us his ship, the cruiser Chicago, spotted on its new and super-secret radar what may have been the Japanese fleet, but would not break radio silence to report it. We showed you Secretary of War Henry Stimson's diary, in which he said the question was how we should maneuver them into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. And we told you the saga of radio man Leslie Grogan of the Matson luxury liner Lurline, and how he tracked the Japanese fleet en route to Hawaii and informed the Navy in Honolulu. Grogan said the Navy then confiscated the Lurline's logs. And earlier tonight, we showed you the mysterious old man memo, which could have been General Marshall's original warning, which omitted instructions to tell the Navy about a possible attack. Also this week, we've showed you a photograph puzzle, purportedly a picture of the Japanese planning the attack. But would a military man wear a bowler hat? Is the gentleman in the center possibly a civilian? And if you notice the lineup of the ships on Battleship Row, it's exactly the same as in this real photograph taken the morning of the attack. The Vestal didn't pull alongside the Battleship Arizona until the night before. This mock-up was used in Japan, but after the attack. It was actually part of a propaganda film called Hawaii Marai Okikaizen, the Battle of Hawaii and Malaya, made in 1942. Further proof that history is not always the way it seems on the surface. Now we come to one of President Roosevelt's most famous speeches, the Day of Infamy address, asking Congress for a declaration of war. This first draft has the changes he made in his own handwriting. Curiously, that famous term infamy was a last-minute addition. The first speech called it a day that will live in world history. But the most interesting part of the draft is at the end of the first paragraph. We all know it to read, "The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." But Roosevelt penciled in the phrase, "without warning," then, for some reason, scratched it out. Was this because he thought the phrase "without warning" was going too far? We began this series by asking the question, why stir up Pearl Harbor again? It's 41-year-old history now. But judging from the response we've gotten this week, the interest in the truth behind it is still very much alive. We've always heard the phrase, "remember Pearl Harbor," and we should. But is it not more important to understand Pearl Harbor and learn from it?
There are so many stories afloat about the background of Pearl Harbor, and there are so many people out there that know things right now that if we could just get them to talk, or just get them interested, get to them, if they knew that the little pieces of the puzzle that they held might fit the whole picture together, then we might solve the whole blasted problem right down to the ground.
We hope that you've learned as much from this series as we've learned from you through your telephone calls and the information you volunteered, and we hope the learning goes on. The intent has been to open the door, to encourage more people to tell their stories so that we can all better understand what happened at Pearl Harbor. We'd like to extend a special thanks to KITV News Director Don Rockwell for his commitment to the series, to the news staff for their support, and especially to author Tony Hodges, who wrote The Mysteries of Pearl Harbor.